The police, the teachers, the entire city believed the 17-year-old honor student had simply run away. For 14 years, that was the only story. But they were looking for a body when they should have been looking for a monster hiding in plain sight. Before we get into this, thank you for being here. I see you all in the comments. Let me know where you're watching from tonight. It means the world to know we're in this together, trying to make sense of the darkness. Because what happened to Julian Hayes is a darkness that lived for 14 years, just on the other side of a wall. Now, let me tell you what really happened. The autumn of 1989 in Canton, Ohio, was a season of crisp air and high school football, a time when the future felt as clear and bright as the Friday night lights. For Julian Hayes, however, the future wasn't measured in yards gained on a field, but in the silent, infinite possibilities of a chessboard. At 17, Julian was a boy sculpted from quiet intensity and startling intellect. He was tall and slender, with a thoughtful, almost solemn expression that often made him seem older than his years. His world was one of logic, patterns, and the elegant certainty of mathematical proofs. While his peers were navigating the turbulent currents of adolescence, Julian was charting the complex constellations of endgame theory, his mind a place of serene, ordered brilliance. He was, by any measure, a golden boy, though he wore the title with an unconscious grace. He was the reigning city chess champion, a title he'd held for 2 consecutive years, dispatching opponents twice his age with a calm, methodical precision that was both fascinating and unnerving to watch. He was a math prodigy, already consuming university-level calculus and theoretical physics, with a hunger that baffled his teachers. He was the pride of Northgate High School, a walking, breathing testament to the power of a focused mind. More than that, he was the pride of his mother, Eleanor Hayes, a registered nurse who worked the demanding evening shift at Mercy Medical Center. Eleanor saw in her son the culmination of all her hopes. She was a single mother, a woman of deep, unshakable faith and a quiet strength that had carried them through lean years. Julian was her world. She saw the light in him, the rare and precious gift of his mind, and she nurtured it with every fiber of her being. Their small, immaculately kept home was filled not with the noise of television, but with the soft rustle of turning pages and the quiet click of chess pieces on a worn wooden board. Julian was not just her son. He was her legacy, a promise of a future that would eclipse the struggles of the past. He was a good boy, a model son. He never broke curfew, never raised his voice, never gave her a moment's worry. His path was a straight, shining line toward an Ivy League scholarship and a life of consequence. That path was being carefully overseen by another formidable figure in Julian's life, Arthur Pierce, the principal of Northgate High. In his late 40s, Pierce was a man who seemed carved from granite and ambition. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a commanding presence and a voice that could silence a rowdy auditorium with a single word. He had taken over Northgate a decade earlier when it was an underperforming, forgotten institution and had, through sheer force of will, transformed it into an academic powerhouse, a beacon of excellence in the state. He was a pillar of the community, an award-winning educator whose name was synonymous with discipline, integrity, and success. Parents trusted him implicitly. The school board revered him. To the students, he was a stern, almost mythic figure, a benevolent dictator who demanded the best, and more often than not got it. He took a special paternalistic interest in his gifted students, the ones he called his scholars. And among these, Julian Hayes was his crown jewel, a once-in-a-generation mind. Pierce would often say to Eleanor during parent-teacher conferences, his voice resonating with what seemed to be genuine admiration, "The world will be his for the taking." This special interest manifested as private mentorship. Pierce began inviting Julian to stay after school, granting him exclusive access to the school's library and, most importantly, to Pierce's own grand, wood-paneled office. It was a sanctuary of academia, lined with leather-bound books and smelling of old paper and lemon polish. There, the two would discuss philosophy, dissect historical military strategies, and play chess. Pierce was a formidable player himself, and their games were epic, silent battles of will and intellect that could stretch for hours. To the outside world, this was a remarkable act of generosity. The esteemed principal, taking a personal interest in a promising black student from a modest background, grooming him for greatness. It was a heartwarming story, a testament to the power of mentorship. But beneath the surface of Pierce's polished public persona, a darker, more obsessive narrative was taking shape. Arthur Pierce was a brilliant but failed academic, a man whose own doctoral ambitions had crumbled under the weight of his own perfectionism and intellectual arrogance. He saw in Julian not just a student, but a vessel, a perfect, untainted mind that he could mold and shape into the masterpiece he himself had failed to become. His interest was not mentorship, it was ownership. He was not a guide, he was a collector, and he had come to believe, with the unshakable certainty of a zealot, that the world outside, with its distractions, its mediocrity, its emotional chaos, was unworthy of Julian. It would only corrupt and waste his perfect genius. In the twisted, lonely corridors of his mind, Pierce had become a curator, and he was preparing to acquire his most prized possession. The culmination of his secret plan arrived on a cool Tuesday in late October. Julian, as was his new routine, had stayed late at school, preparing for an upcoming math Olympiad. He called his mother from the school's payphone just as she was leaving for a shift. "Mom, I'm going to be a little later tonight," he said, his voice calm and clear. "Mr. Pierce wants to talk to me about a fast-track application for a special scholarship at Yale. He said it's a big opportunity." Eleanor's heart swelled with pride. "Oh, honey, that's wonderful. Don't you worry about the time. Just be careful walking home." "I will," Julian promised. "He's waiting for me in his office now. I love you." "I love you too, baby," she replied, her mind already racing with visions of her son walking across an Ivy League campus. Those were the last words she would ever hear from him. Julian hung up the phone and walked down the quiet, echoing halls of Northgate High, his footsteps the only sound in the deepening twilight. The school was empty, a silent, sleeping giant. He felt a familiar sense of peace in the stillness. He trusted Principal Pierce completely. The man was his mentor, his advocate, the architect of his future. He walked toward the principal's office, toward the promise of a scholarship, unaware that he was walking toward the end of his world, his every step taking him closer to a door from which he would not emerge for 14 years. The heavy oak door to Arthur Pierce's office was slightly ajar, a silent invitation. A warm, yellow light spilled into the dim hallway. Julian pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was just as he always found it, immaculate, imposing, and serene. Pierce was standing by his large mahogany desk, not sitting behind it. He was smiling, a wide, paternal expression that seemed to crinkle the corners of his eyes. "Julian, my boy, thank you for coming," Pierce said, his voice a low, reassuring rumble. "I have something truly special to show you, something I reserve for my most dedicated scholars." Julian's heart beat a little faster with anticipation. The Yale scholarship. It was happening. "Of course, sir. Thank you for the opportunity." Pierce gestured not toward his desk, but toward the wall-to-wall, floor-to-ceiling bookcase that dominated the far side of the room. It was a magnificent piece, filled with hundreds of leather-bound volumes that looked as if they hadn't been touched in a century. "The world is a noisy, distracting place, Julian," Pierce began, his tone shifting into the familiar cadence of a lecture. "True genius requires isolation. True focus demands a sanctuary, free from the meaningless chatter of the masses. I had one such place in my university days. It was the making of me, and I have built another one, right here." He walked over to the bookcase, his large frame moving with a surprising grace. He reached for a thick volume of Shakespeare's tragedies, and instead of pulling it out, he twisted it. There was a soft, mechanical click, a sound that was immediately swallowed by the thick carpet. Then, with a quiet, hydraulic hiss, a section of the bookcase, a solid block of shelves and books, swung inward, revealing a dark, narrow opening. Julian stared, his breath catching in his throat. It was like something out of a novel, A secret passage. His 17-year-old mind, attuned to logic and strategy, was momentarily captivated by the sheer ingenuity of it. "After you," Pierce said, his hand gesturing toward the darkness. "A private study, for truly focused work. No interruptions. No distractions. The perfect environment for a mind like yours to prepare." Julian hesitated for only a second. This was his mentor, the man who was paving his way to Yale. His trust was absolute. He stepped over the threshold, his eyes trying to adjust to the gloom. He saw the faint outline of a desk, a chair, more bookshelves. He took another step inside. The sound that came next was not loud, but it was the most final sound he would ever hear. A soft, decisive click as the heavy, disguised door swung shut behind him, followed by the solid, metallic thud of a deadbolt sliding into place. The darkness was suddenly absolute, a thick, suffocating blanket. The air, which had smelled of old paper and polish, was now still and heavy, devoid of any scent from the outside world. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through him. "Mr. Pierce," he called out, his voice sounding small and thin. He turned and fumbled for a doorknob, but his hands found only a flat, seamless wall of books. There was no handle, no lock, no seam. A moment later, the room was flooded with a soft, warm light from an architect's lamp on the desk. Julian blinked, his eyes watering. He was in a small, windowless box, and he was alone. Then a voice, not from the door, but from a small, discreet speaker grill near the ceiling. It was Pierce's voice, but it had lost all its warmth. It was calm, clinical, and terrifyingly serene. "Welcome, Julian. Welcome to your new home. Here, you'll be safe. Here, your mind will be protected from the mediocrity of the world. Here, you will achieve true greatness under my exclusive guidance. There is no escape. There is only our work. Let us begin." Outside the room, in the world that had just vanished for Julian, the clock was ticking. When Julian failed to return home by midnight, Eleanor Hayes began to feel the first stirrings of a fear that would soon become her constant companion. She called the school, but the phone just rang and rang. She called the homes of his few friends. They hadn't seen him. By 2 a.m., her professional composure as a nurse had shattered, replaced by the raw terror of a mother. She called the police. The case landed on the desk of Detective Frank Miller, a 20-year veteran of the Canton Police Department. Miller was a solid, by-the-book cop, a man who believed in evidence, motive, and opportunity. The Julian Hayes case, from the very beginning, had none of it. There was no sign of a struggle, no ransom note, no witnesses. A brilliant, stable, beloved honor student had simply evaporated into thin air. The next morning, Miller's first stop was Northgate High. There, he was met by a distraught Arthur Pierce. The principal was a masterful actor. His face was a mask of grief and worry. He wrung his hands, his voice thick with emotion as he recounted his last conversation with Julian about the scholarship opportunity. "I feel responsible, Detective," Pierce said, sinking his head into his large hands. "I encourage him to stay. I filled his head with these dreams. The boy is a genius, but he's naive. He trusts too easily." Pierce masterfully controlled the narrative. He provided Miller with a list of Julian's academic rivals, subtly planting the seed of professional jealousy. He mused about the dangers of the city, suggesting Julian might have had a chance encounter with the wrong element on his walk home. He even offered a more painful theory. Perhaps the pressure had become too much. Perhaps the golden boy, wilting under the weight of expectation, had simply run away to start a new, anonymous life. This last theory, despite Eleanor's furious objections, gained the most traction. It was the simplest explanation for a case with no evidence. A teenage runaway. It happened all the time. Detective Miller interviewed Pierce in his office. He sat on the leather couch, his back to the very bookcase that held the missing boy captive. He saw nothing but a concerned educator in a room that smelled of order and authority. The investigation spun its wheels for weeks, then months. Leads dried up. Other, more violent crimes demanded attention. The case of the missing honor student, with no body and no clues, was quietly moved to the cold case files. The official narrative was set. Julian Hayes, a boy with the world at his feet, had walked away from it all. It was a tragedy, a mystery, but one that the city and its police force slowly began to forget. But just a few feet away from where the official investigation had ground to a halt, Julian's new reality was just beginning. In a silent, windowless room, a boy was being systematically erased, and a monster's perfect, private experiment had begun. The 14 years that followed Julian's disappearance unfolded like three separate, tragic novels being written simultaneously. For the world outside, time moved on. Seasons changed, technology evolved, and the memory of the missing boy faded into a sad, local legend. But for those at the heart of the story, time either stood still, became a source of haunting regret, or was twisted into a weapon of psychological torment. The first reality was Eleanor Hayes's. Her life became a long, quiet vigil, a testament to a mother's unwavering faith. She refused to believe her son was a runaway. Julian, her disciplined, loving Julian, would never have done that. He would never have inflicted such pain upon her. So she held on. She did not change a single thing in his bedroom. His chess set remained on his desk, the pieces frozen in the middle of a game he'd been playing against himself. His textbooks were still stacked neatly by his bed, a bookmark holding his place in a chapter on quantum mechanics. The room was a shrine, a perfectly preserved moment in time from the autumn of 1989, waiting for its occupant to return. Eleanor's existence became a relentless, heartbreaking routine. Every year, on the anniversary of his disappearance, she would hold a small vigil outside Northgate High, her solitary figure a silent rebuke to the community that had forgotten. She worked tirelessly with National Missing Children Foundations, her son's handsome, smiling school photograph becoming a familiar sight on posters and in mailings across the country. She called Detective Miller's office once a month, every month for years, her voice always polite but firm, asking if there were any new leads, any new information. She was a ghost in the halls of the police department, a constant, living reminder of their failure. Her faith was her shield against the crushing weight of despair, a quiet certainty that one day, God would answer her prayers and bring her son home. The second reality belonged to Detective Frank Miller. He retired in the late 1990s, a respected officer with a solid record of closed cases and commendations. But the Julian Hayes file was a stain on his legacy, a ghost that followed him into his quiet life of fishing and gardening. He'd kept a copy of the case file, and on quiet nights, he would sometimes pull it out, the smiling face of the boy staring back at him. He'd run through the details again and again, searching for the one thing he must have missed. The lack of evidence was absolute, a perfect vacuum. It defied all logic. Miller had investigated murders, robberies, and assaults, crimes of passion and greed. They always left a trace, a thread to pull. But Julian's disappearance was a clean, surgical removal from the world. He'd interviewed Arthur Pierce half a dozen times and had always come away impressed by the man's profound grief and dedication. Miller eventually settled on the runaway theory because it was the only one that didn't require a phantom. He had looked for a criminal, but he had never thought to look for a monster disguised as a saint. The open case file was a symbol of his own limitations, a puzzle he was not clever enough to solve. The third, and most sinister, reality was the one unfolding in the silent, windowless room inside Northgate High. Here, time was not a measure of days or years, but a tool of manipulation in the hands of Arthur Pierce. For 14 years, Pierce lived a meticulous double life. By day, he was the esteemed principal, guiding generations of students. By night, and on weekends, he was Julian's sole keeper, teacher, and God. He would enter the room through a second, hidden entrance in a janitor's closet on the other side of the wall, bringing food, water, and new books. He orchestrated Julian's entire existence. The education continued, but it was a curriculum of Pierce's own design. He provided Julian with advanced texts in science and literature, pushing his intellect to new heights. They played chess, their silent battles the only form of interaction Julian knew. But it was a poison education. Pierce systematically erased Julian's past. He would talk about Eleanor, but in a way that suggested she had been a well-meaning but ultimately limiting influence. He slowly convinced Julian that the outside world was a chaotic, dangerous place that had cast him out, and that only here, in the sanctuary, was he truly safe and appreciated. He controlled every piece of information. There were no calendars, no clocks that showed the date. Pierce would occasionally mention current events, but they were fabricated stories of war, societal collapse, and intellectual decay, designed to reinforce Julian's fear of the world he'd left behind. Deprived of sunlight, social contact, and any external frame of reference, Julian's mind began to warp. His memories of his former life, the smell of his mother's cooking, the feel of autumn air on his skin, the faces of his friends, faded and became unreliable, like scenes from a half-forgotten dream. Pierce, the only constant in his life, the only source of food, knowledge, and human contact, became his entire world. The initial terror and resistance gave way to a slow, creeping dependency. This psychological erosion was Pierce's ultimate triumph. He had not just captured the boy, he had captured his mind. Julian, the prodigy, was now a creature of the room, his brilliant intellect a caged bird singing songs for its captor. He no longer questioned the door that did not open. He no longer dreamed of the sun. His reality was 10 by 12 feet, and its name was Arthur Pierce. The year 2003 arrived, and with it came the inexorable march of progress, a force that even a man as controlling as Arthur Pierce could not hold back indefinitely. Now in his early 60s, Pierce was just a year away from a celebrated retirement. A grand farewell was already being planned by the school board, a final tribute to the man who had given his life to Northgate High. He had curated his legacy as meticulously as he had curated his secret prisoner, and he looked forward to a quiet life of scholarly seclusion, his experiment, a perfect, hidden success he could carry with him to the grave. But the modern world, which he so despised, was about to intrude. For years, the Canton City School District had been planning a massive, bond-funded modernization project. Every school in the district was to be brought up to code, a top-to-bottom overhaul that included new electrical wiring, network cables for the internet, and updated fire safety systems. Pierce had fought it for years, using his considerable influence to delay the project at Northgate, citing the building's historical integrity and the disruption to his students. His resistance was seen as a charming, if stubborn, defense of tradition. In reality, it was the desperate maneuvering of a man guarding a terrible secret. His luck finally ran out. The school board, facing pressure from the state and parents, overrode his objections. The renovations at Northgate were scheduled for the summer of 2003. They would begin with the old, labyrinthine administration wing. A local, non-union construction crew was hired for the job, a team of hardworking men more concerned with getting the work done on time and under budget than with the building's history. The foreman, a man named Dave, unrolled the old, original blueprints for the administration wing. They were a mess of faded lines and archaic notations, but they showed the building's bones, structural walls, plumbing, and the original electrical conduits. On a sweltering morning in late July, the work began. The crew started in the main office, moving filing cabinets and desks. When they reached the principal's office, Arthur Pierce was there to greet them, his face a tight, unreadable mask. He was unusually agitated, hovering over the workers, insisting they take extreme care with the antique furniture, especially the enormous, ornate bookcase. "That piece is a priceless heirloom," Pierce stated, his voice sharper than usual. "It must not be scratched." The crew, accustomed to dealing with fussy clients, carefully maneuvered the heavy bookcase away from the wall. It was a monstrously heavy object, and it took 4 men to slide it out. When it was finally moved, Dave the foreman ran his hand along the wall behind it. He consulted his blueprints again, then frowned. According to the plans, this should be a solid, structural brick wall, the main support for the floor above. But when he knocked on it, it didn't sound right. Instead of a dull, solid thud, there was a faint, hollow echo. "Hey, this ain't right," he called to one of his workers, a young man named Marco. This wall's hollow. Plans say it's brick. Marco shrugged. Old building. Plans are wrong all the time. The job was to run a new, thick conduit for fiber optic cable straight through this wall to the server closet on the other side. A hollow wall just made the job easier. Dave marked the spot with a thick pencil X. Marco grabbed a heavy-duty drill with a long masonry bit, but the plaster was old and thick, reinforced with a wire mesh. After a minute of fruitless drilling, he put it down in frustration. "Just use the sledge," Dave grunted, not looking up from his plans. "We ain't got all day. Punch a hole through. We'll clean it up later." Marco picked up a small, 8-pound sledgehammer. He swung it casually at first, a test strike that sent a web of cracks through the old plaster. He swung again, harder this time. A chunk of plaster and lath fell away, revealing not brick, but modern drywall behind it. It was a wall within a wall. "What the hell?" Marco said, peering at the strange construction. "Just get through it," Dave ordered, his patience wearing thin. Marco set his feet, took a deep breath, and swung the hammer with all his strength. The sound was unlike anything he'd ever heard. It wasn't the crunch of plaster or the crack of wood. It was a dull, resonant boom that was immediately followed by the splintering of the hidden drywall, and then nothing. The hammerhead had broken through into a dark, hollow space. A puff of stale, cold air, smelling of dust and decay, washed over him. Curious, Marco leaned forward and pulled away the broken pieces of wall. He was met with absolute blackness. "Hey, Dave, you gotta see this. There's a room back here. A secret room." Dave came over, annoyed, but his expression changed when he saw the dark void. He pulled a powerful mag light from his tool belt and aimed its bright, white beam into the hole. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating a scene of impossible strangeness. It fell upon a small cot, a desk, and shelves crammed with books. And then it fell upon a figure, huddled in the far corner. A man, pale as a ghost and thin as a skeleton, with wild, dark hair and wide, terrified eyes. The figure shrieked. It was a sound that was barely human, a dry, rasping cry of pure, primal terror. He threw a frail, stick-like arm up to shield his face from the blinding light, a creature of darkness dragged violently into the world. The construction workers stood frozen, the hammer hanging loosely in Marco's hand. They stared, their minds struggling to process what they were seeing. This wasn't a hidden storage space. This was a tomb, and inside it was a living, breathing man. Dave fumbled for his cell phone, his hands shaking so badly he could barely dial. He called 911. "You're not going to believe this," he stammered to the dispatcher. "We're at Northgate High. We just broke down a wall in the principal's office. And there's a man in here. I think he's been living in here." The sound of the hammer had not just broken a wall. It had shattered a 14-year-old's secret, and the echo of its impact was about to bring an entire city to its knees. The discovery of a man inside a hidden wall at Northgate High detonated like a bomb in the quiet summer city of Canton. Within an hour, the school was surrounded by a swarm of police cars, ambulances, and news vans, their flashing lights painting the historic brick building in frantic strokes of red and blue. The scene was one of controlled chaos. The rescued man, identified by a tattered, laminated student ID card from 1989 found in the room as Julian Hayes, was rushed to Mercy Medical Center. He was a ghost, a specter from a forgotten time. He was severely malnourished, suffering from extreme vitamin D deficiency, and his muscles had atrophied to a shocking degree. But his physical condition was secondary to the profound psychological trauma. He was almost completely nonverbal, shrinking from human touch and reacting to the noise and light of the outside world with paralyzing terror. He was a man in his 30s, but in his eyes was the lost, terrified soul of a 17-year-old boy. The case landed on the desk of Detective Isabella Rossi. In her mid-30s, Rossi was a new breed of investigator, sharp, methodical, and holding a degree in forensic psychology. She was known for her ability to see the patterns in chaos, to find the human story buried beneath the cold, hard facts. As she stood in the principal's office, now a sealed crime scene, she knew this would be the most challenging case of her career. Her prime suspect, was immediately clear. Arthur Pierce was taken into custody at his home, a secluded, stately house filled with books and artifacts. He was unervingly calm, his face a mask of scholarly indignation. He denied everything. "This is a preposterous misunderstanding," he stated, his voice steady and firm. "The boy was a troubled runaway. I have no knowledge of how he came to be in that space. It must have been his own doing, a desperate cry for help. He had a plausible, if bizarre, explanation for everything. The hidden room? A panic room installed by a previous, eccentric administrator decades ago, which he had simply covered with a bookcase and forgotten about. The food wrappers and waste? Planted evidence from a boy who had clearly been sneaking in and out for years. He was defiant, arrogant, and utterly convincing. Rossi's investigation was immediately and severely hampered by the state of her main witness. Julian was in no condition to provide a statement. He was suffering from a case of Stockholm Syndrome, so profound that the hospital's top psychiatrists were baffled. He would rock back and forth for hours, whispering mathematical formulas to himself. The only name he would occasionally utter was Mr. Pierce, but his tone was one of reverence, not fear. He was a prisoner who had fallen in love with his cage and his keeper. Without a coherent victim, Rossi's case against Pierce was almost entirely circumstantial. She had a man in a box and another man who held the key, but she had no solid link between them. She and her team began the painstaking process of rebuilding the crime from scratch. They treated the hidden room not as a prison, but as an archaeological site. Every item was bagged, tagged, and analyzed. The books revealed Pierce's curriculum of control: philosophy, history, science, all predating 1990. The simple, gray sweatsuits Julian wore were all the same brand, purchased in bulk. The food remnants showed a consistent, monitored diet. It was a meticulously controlled environment. Rossi's team scoured old-school blueprints and city records. They discovered that the panic room had never existed on any official plan. In fact, they found purchase orders from 1988, signed by Arthur Pierce himself, for an unusual quantity of soundproofing material, drywall, and a specialized, custom-made, magnetically locking door mechanism, all for a vaguely described audio-visual storage project. The pieces were beginning to fit, but it was still not enough to counter a top-tier defense attorney. The pressure on Rossi was immense. The media was in a frenzy, dubbing the case the secret in the wall. Eleanor Hayes, her prayers answered in the most nightmarish way imaginable, kept a constant vigil at her son's hospital bedside, her heart torn between overwhelming joy and profound grief for the shell of man he had become. The breakthrough came from a hunch. Rossi was struck by Pierce's supreme arrogance, his intellectual vanity. A man like that, she reasoned, a man who saw this crime as his life's great work, would have to document it. He would need to record his genius for posterity, even if he was the only one who would ever read it. She ordered a second, more thorough search of Pierce's home, a search that went beyond the obvious. This time, her team was not looking for a weapon or a bloody shirt. They were looking for a diary. For 2 days, they meticulously searched the house, sifting through thousands of books and papers. Finally, in a false bottom of an old steamer trunk in the attic, they found them, a series of more than 20 thick, leather-bound journals. The first entry was dated October 24th, 1989. The handwriting was a neat, precise script. The acquisition is complete. Specimen J is now secure in the controlled environment. The experiment begins. The flawed, chaotic world has been excised. Here, in the purity of isolation, a perfect mind can finally be forged. Rossi sat in her office and read for hours, a growing sense of horror and disgust washing over her. The journals were a chilling, detailed account of Pierce's intellectual experiment. He documented everything: Julian's initial resistance, his slow descent into dependency, his intellectual breakthroughs under Pierce's tutelage, and Pierce's own philosophical justifications for his monstrous crime. He never used the word kidnapping or prison. He called it curation, preservation, the project. The journals were the ghost and the evidence. They were the missing link, the psychological blueprint of the crime. They were the voice of a monster, bragging about his masterpiece. Rossi now had the weapon she needed, not just to convict Arthur Pierce, but to begin the long, arduous process of giving Julian Hayes his life back. The discovery of Arthur Pierce's journals transformed the case. They were a direct, undeniable confession, a roadmap into the twisted architecture of his mind. But for Detective Isabella Rossi, they were more than just the key to a conviction. They were the key to unlocking Julian Hayes. She knew that a jury would see the words, but for Julian to ever have a chance at recovery, he needed to find his own voice to tell his own story. Rossi brought in a top forensic psychologist, a gentle, patient man named Dr. Alan Croft. Together, they devised a strategy. They would not confront Julian with the horror of the journals or push him for details of his captivity. That would only drive him deeper into his shell. Instead, their approach was one of careful, deliberate reconstruction. They had to help him remember who he was before he became Specimen J. The sessions took place in a quiet, softly lit room at the hospital. At first, Julian was resistant, rocking in a chair, his eyes fixed on a point on the floor. The constant, loving presence of his mother, Eleanor, was the first bridge. She would sit with him for hours, not always speaking, but simply being there, a warm, familiar presence in a terrifyingly new world. She would hum the lullabies she sang to him as a child, her soft voice a thread connecting the present to a past he could no longer grasp. Rossi and Dr. Croft began to slowly reintroduce him to his own life. They brought in his old chessboard, the one from his bedroom. His long, pale fingers hovered over the pieces, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than fear appeared in his eyes. It was recognition. He began to move the pieces, replaying the moves of a game he had started 14 years ago. They showed him photographs. A picture of him at age 10, grinning with a missing front tooth and holding a science fair trophy. A photo of him and Eleanor on a small fishing boat, her arm wrapped around his shoulders. He would stare at these images for long periods, his brow furrowed in concentration, as if trying to solve the most complex puzzle of his life, his own identity. They played him music from 1989, the songs that would have been on the radio during his last days of freedom. The sounds, so alien to his silent world, would sometimes make him flinch, but other times, a foot would begin to tap almost imperceptibly to a forgotten beat. Pierce's journals served as their guide. When the journals mentioned Pierce teaching Julian about the Peloponnesian War, Dr. Croft would casually bring up the topic, leaving a book on the table. They were carefully rebuilding the scaffolding of his intellect, but this time they were tying it to the real world, not to the twisted narratives of his captor. The breakthrough came after weeks of these patient, painstaking sessions. Rossi was in the room, observing from a corner. Eleanor was sitting beside Julian, holding his hand. Dr. Croft had just finished reading a poem that Julian had apparently loved as a teenager. The room was silent for a long moment. Then Julian spoke. His voice was a dry and used whisper, but the words were clear, and they were his own. "My name is Julian Hayes." He turned his head and looked, for the first time, directly at his mother. A single tear traced a path down his pale cheek. "He took me from my mother." It was a simple statement, but it was an earthquake. It was the first crack in the foundation of Pierce's psychological prison. It was an acknowledgement of self, of loss, and of the crime that had been committed against him. In that moment, he was no longer Specimen J. He was Julian Hayes, a son who had been stolen. Armed with this emerging testimony and the damning evidence of the journals, the prosecution's case was airtight. Arthur Pierce's trial was short. He remained arrogant and defiant to the end, a fallen god who could not comprehend how his perfect experiment had been discovered. He was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, destined to spend the rest of his days in the kind of cage he had so expertly designed for another. The story does not end with a miraculous, complete recovery. The 14 years that were stolen from Julian Hayes could never be fully returned. His was a life sentence of its own. But the conclusion was one of hope, not despair. Months after the trial, The image that defined the next chapter of his life was not of a courtroom, but of a small backyard. It was Julian, still pale, still thin, but with a new light in his eyes, sitting across a chessboard from his mother. He was teaching her the game, patiently explaining the moves, his voice slowly gaining strength. He was learning to live in a world that had moved on without him, a world of strange technology, new music, and unfamiliar faces. It was a painful, terrifying journey, but he was not on it alone. He had his mother, his anchor to the past, and his guide to the future. The monster was caged, and the ghost who had been found in the wall was slowly, painstakingly, learning not just how to be alive, but how to live.